which is out today from FSG. Sedgwick Wohl is a scholar and translator from the Italian and Portuguese. Her translations include the life of Michelangelo, the lives of the modern painters, sculptors, and architects, and on antique painting. And tonight we're very lucky to have her in conversation with Lisa Miller, who is a writer on staff at New York Magazine. She's a 4-time winner of the New York Newswoman's Club Prize for feature writing, a finalist for the National Magazine Award in feature writing, and a member of the team that won the National Magazine Award for the video project Guns and Empathy in 2017. And we're very lucky to have both of them here in conversation tonight. After their conversation, we'll have time for an audience Q&A, and then we invite you to please buy a book at the register at the counter in front of the store, and then join us here at the signing table for a signing with Alice. Yeah, what's there to say? Please keep your masks on during the event. We have masks at the front of the store if you need one. We do have restrooms to the right. Just knock before entering. There's no code on the door. And make sure your phones are on silent too, if you have your phone with you. So that's it. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for making do with the tight fit. And please join me in welcoming Alice Wohl and Lisa Miller.
At the beginning. Let me see, can you hear me? Yeah. Or is it better with the mic? I want first of all to express my thanks to Christine Pardue and to the Rizzoli Bookstore for holding this event, and to all of you for coming. It's a very great honor for me, especially since Andy Warhol presented one of his books here. I also want to express my deepest gratitude to everyone at Farrell, Straus and Giroux for making this book what it is. My greatest debt, of course, is to Jonathan Galassi for accepting a very untidy manuscript and showing me how to make it into a book. A great editor is like a great orchestra conductor. He knows what the music should sound like, and he brings it forth. I have an equally great debt to his editorial assistant, stand up, Katie Liptak, for her endless patience and kindness and her perfect efficiency. I also want to thank Alex Murto, is he here? For the absolutely stunning design of the jacket. And finally, I want to thank Lauren Roberts, who's also here, the senior publicist, for everything she's done to bring this book to the attention of the press and the public. I want also to thank her for the beautiful poem she wrote about Edie, after reading about her and hearing me describe Edie riding in an interview with Stephen Watson. Now to begin, I'd like to read you a brief section of the prologue to let you know what this rather eccentric book is and how I happened to write it. Spring 2019. I've outlived my brother Bobby for more than 50 years now, and ever since he died, I've been talking to him and making notes in my mind. I'm told that happens when you lose a sibling to whom you're close. You're left with a phantom presence, like an amputee with a phantom limb. It's not that I keep track of anything systematically. I just find myself stopping from time to time to fix particular perceptions and ideas, trying to imagine what he would think. Because things here have been going in a direction that neither he nor I would ever have anticipated. In the 60s, it was clear that a big shift was taking place. And from our different vantage points, we were both hopeful. But as it turned out, it was not the radical social and political change that either of us was looking for. Instead, it turned out to be a shift in an entirely new direction, one that had to do with what Andy Warhol and our sister Edie Sedgwick represented when they got together in 1965. But Bobby didn't live to see that, and I wasn't paying attention. And then a couple of years ago, I happened to be visiting the Addison Gallery at Andover, and there on the top floor, I suddenly came upon two very large images of Edie. Two close-ups of her head and face, side by side on a film screen, one bright, one dark, in velvety blacks and chalky whites against a flat black ground. I knew it had to be a clip from a Warhol film I'd read about called Outer and Inner Space, because what I was seeing was the image of a real Edie at the right, responding to a video image of herself on a television monitor at the left, and relaying her reactions to someone outside the frame. At first I was startled just to see Edie so alive and vital when she'd been dead for nearly half a century. But what astonished me was the presence she had on camera. I could not take my eyes off her. At the same time, I thought I was seeing a very complex play upon the figure of Narcissus, the beautiful Greek boy who fell fatally in love with his own image. But what I was really seeing, and seeing for the first time, was what Andy Warhol made of Edie Sedgwick. That was the beginning of everything that I'm trying to think about now. I'm trying to figure out exactly what happened when Edie got together with Andy. I want to know what she had that I so totally failed to see, but that he saw and put to such effective use. I want to understand what he was up to, because right now, it seems to me that when the two of them got together, something was set in motion that led to the present that we are all living out. I think you need to hold it. I'm easily rattled. And now I'd like to show you a series of pictures. And most of them belong to Edie herself. They were still in her collection when she died, and they came to me by one of the many flukes that have attended this project as I've gone along. It turned out that one of my neighbors had them because he'd lived for a while with the guy who inherited them, and they came to me. So all the pictures of Edie by herself, Edie on a horse, and Edie with our father, were pictures that Edie kept all her life. I want to show them to you in order to establish in your mind just exactly what her life was before she burst onto the scene in New York in the summer of 1964. Because a lot of people seem to think she was a city girl, a high society debutante from Boston. And none of that's true. None of it. Edie grew up on a cattle ranch, very isolated, in the Santa Ynez Valley in California. And she lived and went to school on the ranch. And she lived there almost without interruption for the first 20 years of her life. So, there she is. She's already just loving being her. You can see it. Here are our parents on their new gray horses. And it was a working ranch. So there we all are. That's my father in the front. And there are miscellaneous children on their horses in the back, and my mother. And I must have been away at boarding school already because the white horse in the corner is my horse and somebody else is riding it. But here I am. I was 11 at the time, and that was the first great love of my life. Edie was the seventh of 8 children. I'm the eldest. I'm at one end of the sawhorse, and she's next to youngest, 12 years younger, and she's at the other end. And here she is with her father around 1946. She was about 3 and he was 42. And if any of you finds this picture shocking, I found it very shocking. But it says a lot about him, what he was like, in 1942 or 45, or whenever this picture was taken, men's bathing suits were something you would laugh at now. I mean, they came down to people's knees, they had gathered, and he's wearing something tiny and he's even tucked it up. This is one of my favorite pictures of Edie. I think, and it tells you what the sense of scale was that we had riding in that landscape. It was so beautiful, and you can't, these are black and white pictures, so you can't have any idea how glorious that landscape was. But it also tells you, I can't even describe what it was like to be alone on a horse in such an enormous landscape. And Edie loved that, and so I want you to know that about her. Here she is with her own first horse, who was named Sorillo for skunk. And here she is on Sorillo. We were all riding, and we were supposed to be having a Christmas card made. But look at Edie, she's kicked her horse forward, and she's looking around at Fuzzy, my father, and he's looking at her. If you want to consider this metaphorically, Edie was the only one in our whole family who was never punished or even criticized for being out of line. And the rest of us were dealt with very severely. So there she is. Now, when, in 1952, about this time, my parents bought a larger ranch because they'd found oil on the original cattle ranch that we had. And with that oil money and some other money that they got together, they bought a ranch that was almost twice as big. And there were fewer children at home by now. So Edie and Suki, her younger sister, our younger sister, were alone a lot on that ranch. And this, I think this image is very beautiful, very touching. It tells you how beautiful that ranch was. In fact, and this is important to know, every 2 years, starting in 1945, one of us would go off to boarding school. So it was kind of like that play by Thornton Wilder called Our Town. Every so often someone would leave the stage. And at the end, Edie and Suki were alone for a while when Kate went off to school. And then Edie tried to go to boarding school, but she couldn't handle it, and she came home. So she and Edie were there for a couple of years. And then Edie and Suki went off to boarding school, and Edie still couldn't handle it. So then she came home, and she was at home alone with our parents for most of every year for the next 3 years. And there she is on a really beautiful horse called Rumpelstiltskin. And I want to say right now that she was one of the best riders I've ever seen in my life. And she was totally fearless. I mean, I'm a pretty good rider, but I'm careful. Edie she was just flat out all the time, and you can see, I mean, you really could use some stirrups and a little support on a steep hill. And Edie was such a good rider that she would even do cattle work bareback. And she loved it, not that she did much work. I don't remember her ever doing cattle work, but I'm told she did. So this picture and that picture you just saw really define Edie's life until she left the ranch. The ranch was isolated and Edie was confined to it. The only interruptions were other and stricter forms of confinement. As I said, she went twice to boarding school, first when she was 13 and again when she was 15, but she couldn't stay, in part because of the bulimia, and in part because she just would not accept any rules ever, or any restraints of any kind or anyone ever telling her what to do. She went back to the ranch after school, and she was alone there with our parents until she was 19, when they put her in a mental hospital to be cured of bulimia. And she spent 9 months divided between 2 hospitals, the first of which was open, but the second was closed. I mean, for sheer confinement. She got better though. She really did get better. I was visiting her every week and I could see her getting better. When she was discharged, she returned to the ranch for the summer. And at the end of that summer, our parents sent her to Cambridge alone to study sculpture. She was 20 years old and had never been on her own, never done anything for herself, never been unsupervised. That was in September 1963. And here she is 20 months later. Isn't she fantastic? She's fantastic. Look at her. Because the only thing that I could compare to riding is probably surfing. And she loved the sea. There's another picture in this sequence of her doing cartwheels in that same fancy suit in the water. She was extremely athletic. She was a beautiful athlete, a beautiful swimmer. But just look how joyful she is. So this is the other image I want you to retain in your minds as you think about Edie. And now I want to thank Lisa Miller, my friend whom I met, we all met, with her father and her husband and her daughters, who's not here unfortunately, riding at a ranch that we all go to in Arizona. So I want to thank Lisa and say how really grateful I am to you for conducting this interview.
I'm so happy to be doing this. I love Alice. I love Alice's family. I love Alice's book. And it is a privilege and a pleasure to be having this conversation with you today. I will never forget the evening. I knew Alice's family and my family had been going to this ranch in Arizona for many years, and I knew Alice and her family for many years before one night we were sitting at dinner, and I don't know, she was alluding to her sister, and I can't remember what made me ask, who is your sister? And she said, Edie Sedgwick, and I practically fell out of my chair.
You're not the only person.
And so, one of the things I wanted to ask you just straight up was, what inspired you to write this book now? What inspired you to talk about Edie and try to understand Edie differently now? And also talk about and try to understand Andy differently now, because I know that you're an art historian and you have a very deep education in art and art history, but it's more traditional classical art and not Warhol. And so tell me about sort of beyond the first image we saw, which was an aha moment for you. What made you want to re-excavate both Edie and Andy?
Well, and now I'm talking to Jean Stein's daughter, Katrina. I wish Jean Stein were here so I could give her credit. When Edie died, Jean Stein loved her, and she came to me, and she asked, she said she wanted to write a biography of Edie. She said it would be an oral history, and that I didn't really understand that was until I came right up against it at the end and it was published. But she and I had known each other in boarding school from the time she was 14 and I was 15 or 16. And we'd stayed in touch. And I knew she loved Edie. And she thought of Edie as Peter Pan. And instead of saying I didn't want to talk, I told her to get on the train and I would pick her up. Now, I was brought up in a family where nobody said anything. I don't think anybody in this room can imagine how families like mine were. You just did not speak about anything. I mean, Edie could she'd eat everything on her plate, and then she'd leave the table, and she'd come back and fill up her plate, and nobody said a word. Nothing was ever, not only that, we were never allowed to say anything or to ask questions. We were never told what was going to happen. Everything. But when Jean came to me, then my brothers had died, and Edie had died. And when it's that extreme, and when you know that that's happening in other families, because other families of friends of my parents had children who were dying of drug overdoses and didn't talk about it. You can't be quiet. You cannot be silent. And also, Jean had the most breathlessly intense and attentive and respectful manner of interviewing. And then what? Oh, and then what? I mean, it was irresistible. And so I told her everything. Whatever she asked, I answered it. And we talked about all of it. And I said a lot of stupid and limited things because I had a very old-fashioned way of looking at the world. I looked at the world out of the tradition in which I'd grown up. And you have to have eyes to see what's in front of you, or you won't see it. So I didn't see Edie. I thought, I knew her, of course, and I've seen a lot of her when she was in the hospital because I saw her every week. But Edie had the strangest presence. She just was in herself. What she did was often annoying. She was wasteful. She had no conversation. She had no education. She wasn't interested. She was just alive. And she was so alive.
There's this amazing, one of my favorite sections in the book is this scene of Edie riding at night. Edie particularly loved to ride at night. She and Suki would go galloping flat out in the stubble fields, and I know why. Riding in the darkness under the moon and stars is like floating. It's like riding in the waves, because you can't really see the ground, you can only feel, and the feeling is pure exaltation. Edie also found it exhilarating to ride in a storm. And there was just something about that I found so affecting and so moving and so vivid, and I would love for you to talk about what you think, draw a straight line between her experience, her physical experience of riding in the ranch and the landscape and being in the landscape, and what she later became. This comet, this presence, this image, this event that she ended up becoming.
But it's the same. It's exactly the same. As I told Stephen Watson, Edie rode her life. She rode it.
And so she wasn't thinking about what she meant.
No, she wasn't self-conscious at all. She just was.
Right.
And she was, Andy says something about her. He says she was all energy. He says she didn't know what to do with it when it came to her life. But she was fantastic to film. And it's precisely what you see, the intensity of her presence on film is exactly that. And it's the quality that she had. And it's what you see here.
Well, and fearlessness, right?
Totally.
I mean, the fearlessness of riding at night and the fearlessness of appearing on film the way she did, right? She was completely herself.
Yeah, she wasn't self-conscious at all.
Right.
If you were self-conscious, would you go about in your tiny little black underwear?
No, I would not. Right, some of the descriptions of Edie walking around Paris in her underwear are
Well, in her leotard and tights.
and her mink coat. We've talked a lot about the symbiosis between Andy and Edie, what he saw in her, what she saw in him, how they melded to become a phenomenon together that was bigger than each of them separately. And we've talked a lot about how he had this sort of intellectual tools and the vision to understand what it meant to project her image out into the world. And she had the intuitive or understanding about what it meant to be an image. Yes? Am I saying that right?
I don't know how to say it. I
She-
think all I can say about Edie is that she simply was the way she was like a creature.
So there's this quote from Patti Smith where she talks about being a teenager and coming across images of Edie in Vogue. There are these very famous images of Edie from Vogue in 1966. And Patti Smith says, you have to understand where I came from. Living in South Jersey, you get...
It represented everything to me. Radiating intelligence, speed, being connected to the moment. The image captured Patty's imagination so powerfully, she said, that she actually got a crush on Edie and would travel all the way to Manhattan just to hang around outside the discotheques anyway. And you wanted to ask about Nora Ephron?
Yes.
Well, see, I have never been to a discotheque in my life, and I suspect that Nora Ephron was just like me. Patti Smith was in her late teens then, but Nora Ephron was older and she was annoyed. She couldn't see why anybody was getting so much attention. She wrote, Edie Sedgwick is the girl that everybody's talking about. Nobody is quite sure who the everybody is who's talking about her, but no matter. There's too little now that's happening and too many words to write and television talk shows to film to leave a phenomenon like Edie Sedgwick alone. So this is what I wrote when I noticed that. There's an old sensibility that doesn't understand how someone with no accomplishments, whatever, can be getting all that attention. And there's a brand new sensibility that's attuned only to images. But I just want to tell you how extraordinary it was. You know that Youth Quaker picture? There were about 20 other people on that list. And Edie got the biggest picture and the biggest caption.
And some of those people were?
Peter Zirkin, Joan Rivers, Frank Stella, and Bill Cosby.
So what was it about her? Like,
I don't know. I don't know. I went on asking that question throughout the book, and I was unable to answer it until Randy Borshite, who may be here, he gave me the answer, and he made it possible for me to end my book. And let me tell you what he said. I talked to him about half an hour, and I've been talking to all kinds of people saying, and I would say, what was it about her? How? Because I was right there and I didn't see it. I could see that it was so, but that's different from really seeing it. And finally, Randy Borshite, who was a friend of Andy's, and he saw Edie several times a week for nearly a year at the factory and everywhere around town. He was also in some of Andy's films. He couldn't tell me either. What he did say was that she was beautiful, that she had a special relationship to Andy. She was not social. He didn't remember her talking. And he got the sense that she was solitary. Now, solitary doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of people around. I think what he's describing is that she was contained in herself. But here's what he said that made it possible for me to make peace with it and just let it be. He said she could be known only by what she evoked in others.
I mean, this reminds me of something else that you've sent to me, which was that Andy wanted to be Edie. Can you talk about that? So she evoked in him a desire to be her. Can you talk about that and what that...
He talks about it all the time.
Yeah. Explain it.
Well, Andy had had a very difficult time. He was, his skin was bad, he wore that wig, and, I don't think he thought of himself as attractive. But when they met, incidentally, everybody thinks that she painted her hair. He painted his, and he says so.
She walked in there with the painted hair already.
Yes, she liked the idea of light hair and dark eyes, and Andy began to wear a silvery wig to look like her. And then she began wearing leotard and tights, and he began wearing tight black pants. And in a very short time, they were, in some way that I don't understand, they were one image. The two of them constituted one image.
And it was during that time also that he was being photographed, right? And he was refining his own image.
He was creating it.
Mm-hmm.
David McCabe, Andy was crazy about publicity, and that's another thing that Edie brought to him, aside from an entree into society. Edie could get publicity just by getting out of bed. I've never seen anybody like her. But Andy, I lost my thread.
He was refining his image, he was creating his image as she was in.
David McCabe, he hired a young English fashion designer called David McCabe and asked him to photograph him everywhere he went for a year, from the summer 1964 to the summer of 1965. At the end, he took all the contact prints and showed them to Warhol. And Warhol sat down with them. He looked at them all with a magnifying glass, and he didn't buy one print. What he wanted, and McCabe said that, it was printed in his obituary a few months ago. What he wanted was to see how he was presenting himself to the public. So Edie came into his life during that year, and McCabe also said that when he first met Warhol, he was open and smiley and normal and friendly. And by the end of the year, he had developed that defensive persona, that recessive presence and non-committal manner, and he wore the wraparound glasses. And he had created, and I call that putting up his hat on a stick.
Yeah.
Just because he didn't want to be, he wanted to protect himself because he was hypersensitive.
Talk about actually the image on the cover of the book, which is such an extraordinary image, and it goes to this thing that you're talking about, which is their image together as one thing.
Isn't that outrageous?
Yes.
It's so fantastic.
It is. They've become a single organism.
But this is, and David McCabe took that.
Yeah. It's quite amazing. What is it that you learned about, you are an art historian, what is it that you learned about Warhol that you didn't appreciate before?
That he was a genius. I didn't see it, but now I see it every time I look at him.
You were Nora Ephron in that moment?
Totally. But once I saw the picture, once I saw Outer and Inner Space, all I had to see was a tiny clip. And I knew he was a genius. And I knew that Edie was extraordinary. Because he made me see it.
Could you talk more about that? What did he make you see about her and about him both in that initial
I
moment?
saw that the film was unbelievably brilliant. I mean, what he did, first of all, somebody lent him a video camera, and it was before anybody ever had one.
Yeah.
I mean, Nam June Pike and Bill Viola, they didn't know. Nobody had one. No, there was no video art, no nothing. He took it. He made two 35 minute videos of Edie. And then he played them on a television monitor. And he filmed Edie responding to herself.
Uh-huh.
And then he showed them this way on two huge screens. So there were four heads of Edie, all at the same time.
Yeah. What is it, this is, I think, the last question before we take questions. What is it that people misapprehend about the unraveling of Edie and Andy?
I think Jean thought that Andy had destroyed Edie, that he had used her up and thrown her away. And one reason we had that long 9-year dialogue was that was the opposite was true.
What happened?
Edie, I mean, here's how amazing Edie was. She was in the gossip columns, and Bob Dylan heard about her and called her up in December. This was months before she met Warhol, and she began going out with Bob Dylan.
And you said to me on the phone, you said, and I don't think she even knew who Bob Dylan was.
Of course she did. She said she didn't know who Bob Dylan was. She didn't know who anybody was. There's that wonderful story that Stephen Watson quotes of Edie and Andy in Paris. And there's a big fuss being made. They're in Vogue, they're in Powder Match, and they're at dinner with Salvador Dali, and Stephen describes it beautifully. I quote him in my book. They're sitting at the table, and the spotlights are on them, so that indicates celebrity. And in the midst of it all, Edie leans over and asks Salvador Dali what it feels like to be a great writer. And nobody cared. Nobody thought that she was ignorant, and she was. She did not know anything. She wasn't interested.
I do have one more question before we go to questions, which is, we've talked about Edie as a precursor to influencers, but as we've discussed it, she was image. She was image, but she didn't have the how would you call it? She wasn't calculating. She wasn't strategic. She wasn't interested in commodifying her image. And so if she wasn't a precursor to an influencer, what was she a precursor to?
I don't know that she was a precursor to anything. She was an image. And she also had, her dark side was influential. We have a neighbor in the country. Shall I read some of the things that, I have a neighbor who's actually a friend of Katrina's sister, Wendy, and she had been fascinated by Edie all her life. When she met my son, who was out hiking, she was astonished to find out that I was Edie Sedgwick's sister. And so, because she'd been interested, and a lot of girls are, it turns out, in Edie since she was very small. And so I went to see her, and her story is in here, and it's amazing. But here's what she said about Edie. She was a generation younger, and she had known about Edie from the time she was little. She didn't read the book about Edie until she was 14 years old, and then she painted this extraordinary mural of Edie's face on her bedroom wall. But here's the list of things that she said she got from Edie. She wanted to be Edie, to be someone whose suffering people cared about. Part of Edie's draw was that she had everything and couldn't value or access it. She identified with Edie because she too had been raised living as if, in other words, in unreality. She was also anorexic and addicted, as Edie was. She was starved for attention, and she saw that Edie knew how to get it. Edie gave her permission to live nihilistically, narcissistically, without caring about anyone or anything. And there's more. But that's a dimension of Edie's importance that I think we should all bear in mind.
I live near San Ynez in Las Cruces. I live near San Ynez in Las Cruces, where the hot springs were. Maybe you knew that. I also am a documentary filmmaker, and I filmed Albert Maysles, who also filmed another Edie, who was a mover and shaker. And in listening to you, I think of also Neil Cassidy. And one of the things I wonder about is this bulimia. What is a defining thing that got her into the dark side? Was she molested as a child, do you know?
I don't know for a fact. She might have been. She certainly said my father behaved inappropriately. But she was a terrible liar. And I don't know. My father behaved inappropriately with me once. And so, it's possible.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.
We're all Edie addicts here. My question is, did you see that she was headed for a downfall with Andy? And, okay, do you feel that if it wasn't Andy, it might have happened somewhere else along the line?
I want to make something very, very clear. Andy Warhol was the single best thing that ever happened to Edie. She would have burned out. She was addicted to legal drugs when Andy met her. My mother and father put her in the psychiatric hospital, and from that time on she had legal drugs. But before that, at one moment, Edie found my father on the floor with a young woman, and it was a very big shock to her, and she ran out of the room. And her story is, and my brothers believed her, my brother Jonathan believed her, that then he called the doctor, and he said she was crazy, and she was shut in her room for months and kept sedated. And I know that's true because the other children, I was in college at the time and I was not ever on good terms with my family, so I didn't go home. But my other siblings did go home at Christmas 1957, and Edie was in her room and they never saw her. So I think that story is true. And that, of course, made it impossible for Edie to seek treatment. Also, to go back to the question of Edie's addiction, Ondine says in a novel, he says that she was addicted coming in and that Andy had nothing to do with her addiction. Andy made a star, a superstar, and an enduring figure out of Edie. And she would have burned out and been an ephemeral figure otherwise. I really believe that.
I have a big voice, so. Thank you for your nice book, and
No, I'm sorry, I'm deaf.
You can't hear? Okay, fine, I'm not gonna blow everyone else's ears out. But you speak very benevolently of her time with Andy Warhol, and then could you contrast that then with how Dylan seemed to predict her demise? And then secondly, forgive me, and I know she's a family member, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but to me she sounds like a Kardashian, devoid of skills. She's never devoted herself to anything but pleasure and accompanying famous people. And I'll shut up right now. Respectful.
No, she's not like a Kardashian. And I'll tell you how. She would never have monetized her. She had evidently a quality that wherever she went, she got attention. The Kardashians worked for it and they monetized it. Now, I'm not saying that Edie didn't she loved having attention, always did from the time she was small, but she would never have made a selfie of herself. She just wanted other people to pay attention. She wanted them to listen to her, she wanted them to look at her, but she was not avaricious, or I don't think she wanted to be a celebrity even. Andy understood how to monetize things, but Edie didn't. She really didn't.
And the Dylan contrast between your perspective?
That's complicated because Dylan denies it, and I wasn't able to ascertain. But I do know that she was on heroin after she was with him. But she was not only with
After Dylan or after?
Yes, with Warhol in the factory. I think that it was all amphetamines, and in Dylan's milieu it was heroin. She went to stay in Woodstock, and she had an affair with Dylan's assistant, Bob Newworth, who she always said was the great love of her life. But she just wasn't, she didn't think that way. She just wanted attention. And she wanted to be her life and live her life in the most headlong way possible. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
And believe me, I disapproved of her too. Not the only person.
Just like the adulation of her, I don't know what she ever accomplished, other than hanging out with famous men.
I have nothing to say to that.
I understand.
Any other questions?
I understand.
On that note, I am a young person who very clearly comes from a different era of this sort of godlike iconography in art and fashion. And I just want to know what you want specifically for the legacy of Edie Sedgwick in the future, or maybe when, how much control do you have of it, or what you would want, honestly, of the rest of this sort of continual story.
I'll tell you what, I'm just happy for her. I'm happy for Edie. That people are interested in her, that she's important, and I'm extremely happy for her that she met Andy Warhol. Say who you are. Say who you are.
It's a great pleasure to be in your company and to have read your book. And why are we having to constantly say, why do we look for Edie's symphony or building or control of government or anything when she was one of the greatest stars in the medium of movies that anyone had ever seen? She was magic, but okay. No one has to apologize for her lack of tangential, of achievement. Okay.
Exactly.
The main thing is, you and I constantly having to absolve Andy from being Edie's doom. I've heard this from members of your own family. I'll tell you who they were later. But you are part of that crowd. They killed our Edie. They poisoned our Edie. The movie, that awful movie, ends with someone coming up to Andy on the street and saying, "Oh, did you see that Edie died?" And he says, "Oh, she should have told us. We would have filmed it." And that's where it leaves him. And so I was a mini advisor to the movie, but I remember after the screening, people walking out and saying, "I never knew Andy Warhol was such an asshole. I never knew he was so mean and cruel and ruined it." But he didn't, and you know he didn't, and I know he didn't.
Well, you lived it, and you know.
But the doom was upon her, shall we say, like the Lady of the Lake. The doom was upon her, and he glorified
Was
the
it
beauty
reprieve?
and he didn't accelerate the doom. It was a trajectory with this
Exactly. You're absolutely right. I have nothing more to say, that's right.
Oh, I'm Danny Fields. I was
Danny Fields.
known as Edie's roommate because she stayed with me for 2 weeks. And
Edie
that's how I'm
spent,
identified.
Edie spent months with this saint. And he said, he wrote me the most enchanting letter. He said, "I think I'm going to go down in posterity as Edie Sedgwick's roommate." When my grandmother kicked Edie out, or the lawyer kicked Edie out of my grandmother's apartment, Danny took her in,
Yeah.
and she spent
Yeah, stayed for the weekend.
several
Yeah.
months. And you took her to the World's Fair where she wanted to go, and she disappeared into the ladies' room for 2 hours and didn't come out.
Yeah. And what do? There were 5 guys, and you just find a woman coming out saying, "Would you see if someone is spending an excessive amount of time in her eyelashes?" It's the World's Fair. You couldn't. So 2 hours? Okay, we were lucky it wasn't 3. Maybe it was.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
I really think, and this is all my last word, I think Andy Warhol was a genius, and that Edie had something so extraordinary about her, which you see and which Danny sensed, but it was the being of a creature, and not the being of somebody who was intentional. She was not intentional. She just was. Right? Thank you.
I think we can close there. We feel very lucky that we hosted them here tonight, and thank you all for coming. And we're going to have a signing at the table now. If you'd like to get the book, please do get the book. It's available for sale at the register at the